The air in my New York office was sterile, recirculated, and carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken compromises. It was 1994, and by every conceivable metric, I had reached the summit. A Princeton degree framed on the wall, a vice president's title at the prestigious hedge fund D.E. Shaw, and a salary that placed me firmly within the gilded cage of American success. I wore the uniform, the impeccably tailored suit, the silk tie knotted with mathematical precision, but each morning, as I stared at the frantic energy of Wall Street below, I felt a profound disconnect. The hum of the city wasn't a sound of excitement. It was the drone of a machine I understood too well, a machine I was helping to fuel. It was a life of quiet predictability, and it was slowly suffocating me. The disquiet began as a whisper, a faint, intellectual itch in the back of my mind. It grew louder during my long commutes, echoing in the silent spaces between the numbers and forecasts that filled my days. I was analyzing, of all things, the emerging landscape of something called the Internet. Most of my colleagues saw a curious novelty, a digital playground for academics and hobbyists. But as I delved deeper, the data revealed a truth so explosive it was almost blinding. This wasn't a trend, it was a tectonic shift. The user base was growing at an astronomical, almost incomprehensible rate, 2,300% per year. A number that large doesn't just suggest change, it screams revolution. And in the heart of that revolution, a single, crystalline idea began to form. A bookstore. Not a cramped shop with dusty shelves and limited inventory, but a limitless, universal one. A place where any book, no matter how obscure, could find its reader. A place that existed not on a street corner, but in the ether, accessible to anyone with a computer and a phone line. The vision was so clear, so compelling, it became an obsession. I would lie awake at night, designing the logistics in my head, imagining the sheer scale of it. The whisper had become a roar. This is where most people stop. The dream remains a fantasy, a what if, to be pondered over a drink. The chasm between a safe, established life and a risky, uncertain dream is too wide to cross. I knew I needed a bridge, a logical framework to justify the illogical leap. I invented what I called the regret minimization framework. I projected myself forward in time, to the age of 80. I imagined myself as an old man, reflecting on my life, turning the pages of my own history. I asked myself a simple, brutal question. At the end of my life, what will I regret more? Trying to build this online bookstore and failing? Or never trying at all, and forever being haunted by the question of what could have been? The answer was immediate and visceral. The regret of inaction would be a permanent, dull ache, a companion for my twilight years. The regret of failure, however, would be a temporary scar, a badge of honor earned in the arena. The safe choice was, in the long run, the most dangerous one. The decision was made. The next step was the hardest. I scheduled a meeting with my boss, a man I deeply respected for his brilliant, analytical mind. We walked through Central Park, the autumn leaves crunching under our polished shoes. I laid out my vision, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. I told him about the Internet, the growth, my idea for the bookstore. He listened patiently, his expression one of thoughtful consideration. "Jeff," he said finally, his tone calm and rational, "that sounds like a really good idea, but it would be a better idea for someone who didn't already have a good job." It was the most sensible advice anyone could have given. It was the voice of Wall Street itself, of calculated risk and guaranteed returns. And in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was making the right choice. I was not that someone. I was me. I thanked him, resigned, and walked away from the golden handcuffs. My then-wife, Mackenzie, was my first and most crucial partner. When I told her of my plan to drive across the country and start a company in a garage, she didn't flinch. She saw the same future I did. Her belief was not just emotional support, it was a strategic pillar. Within weeks, we had packed our lives into the back of a Chevy Blazer. The life we left behind in New York fit neatly into a few boxes. The life ahead of us was a map yet to be drawn. The drive to Seattle was a pilgrimage. We were leaving the epicenter of the old world's finance for the frontier of the new world's technology. The landscape shifted from dense urban sprawl to rolling hills, then to vast, open plains that seemed to stretch into infinity. It felt symbolic. We were trading a confined, predetermined path for limitless, unknown possibility. We rented a small house with a detached, single-car garage. It had a dusty concrete floor, exposed insulation, and a heavy, rattling door you had to heave open manually. This was our cathedral. Our first capital expenditure was a trip to the local hardware store. We bought solid-core doors, 2x4s, saws, and nails. I remember the feel of the wood, the smell of sawdust, the satisfying weight of the hammer in my hand. We built our own desks, crude and sturdy. They were not beautiful, but they were ours. We had built the very foundation of our enterprise with our own hands. Naming the company felt like a sacred act. I initially chose Cadabra, as in abracadabra, to suggest magic. But my lawyer soon called. "Jeff," he said, sounding concerned, "people are hearing cadaver. You might want to reconsider." He was right. I needed a name that spoke to scale, to immense flow, to something that carried all before it. I started with the A's, wanting to be at the top of alphabetical lists. And there it was, Amazon, the mightiest river on earth, carrying more water than the next 7 largest rivers combined. It was a name that held our ambition. We would carry everything. On July 5, 1994, we officially launched. Our server, a handful of powerful computers, whirred and blinked in the corner of the garage. We had a bell that we planned to ring every time a sale was made. In those first days, the silence in the garage was punctuated only by the hum of the machines and our own hopeful conversations. We waited. And then, one afternoon, it happened. A soft ding from the computer, a notification. A sale. We all froze for a second, then erupted. We crowded around the screen, a small team of believers staring at the proof that it was real. Someone rang the bell, a single, clear, triumphant chime that echoed in the sparse garage. We had sold a book. To a stranger. In a place we had never been. It was a tiny, digital handshake, a connection that spanned a continent. It was more validating than any bonus, any title. It was the first brick in a foundation we were building not just for a company, but for a new way of life. We had set sail on a vast, digital ocean, our tiny raft buoyed by that first, crucial sail. The future was a blank map, and we were drawing the coastline with every line of code, every packed box. We felt invincible. We had no way of knowing that the greatest storm of our lives was already gathering force on the horizon, a tempest that would test our raft to the point of splintering, and force us to discover if we were truly builders or just dreamers. The chime of that first sail became our heartbeat. In those early months, the garage was a symphony of organized chaos, the rumble of the manual door opening at dawn, the frantic tapping on keyboards, the screech of packing tape being ripped from rolls, and the beautiful, sporadic ringing of our bell. We were a small crew, fueled by equal parts caffeine and conviction. Each ring was a victory, a validation that our digital bookstore was finding its readers. We'd cheer every 10th sale, then every 100th. The numbers were small, but the trajectory was clear. We were climbing. But a startup's growth is never a smooth, upward curve. It's a series of heart-stopping leaps and terrifying stalls. Our first major test came not from competitors, but from our own nascent infrastructure. One afternoon, our website, the very storefront we had painstakingly built, simply crashed. For 6 hours. 6 agonizing hours where we were not just losing sales, we were breaking the fragile trust of our earliest customers. I remember the cold knot in my stomach as I watched the error messages flash. In that silent garage, the only sound was the frantic clicking of mice and our own worried breaths. We were a ghost town. It was a brutal lesson. Our ambition had outstripped our technical foundation. We weren't just booksellers. We were architects of a system that needed to be unshakable. We rebuilt, we reinforced, we learned. The team worked for 48 hours straight, fueled by pizza and a shared, desperate determination. When the site came back online, stronger than before, there was no celebration, only a grim understanding. This was war, and our first skirmish had been with our own creation. Then, the real external pressures began to mount. As 1999 bled into 2000, the air in the tech world became thick with a frenzied, irrational exuberance. The dot-com bubble was inflating to its bursting point. Venture capital was flowing like water, and every startup with a .com in its name was being hailed as the next revolution. We were caught in the riptide. Our stock price, which had climbed steadily, began to soar on a wave of pure speculation. It was dizzying and deeply unsettling. I would read the financial papers and feel a growing sense of dread. Analysts who had never used our service were praising our vision. Our valuation was becoming untethered from our reality, which was still simple: sell more books than the month before, and do it efficiently. I gathered the team. "Ignore the noise," I told them, my voice cutting through the euphoria. "The stock price is not the company. The customer's experience is the company. Focus on the customer. Obsess over the customer." It became our mantra, a shield against the madness. But the madness was relentless. We were pressured to spend lavishly, to acquire other companies, to expand at a breakneck speed that felt reckless. I refused. We stayed the course, investing not in lavish parties or Super Bowl ads, but in our warehouses, our logistics, and our website. We were building a machine, not a firework. My insistence on long-term fundamentals over short-term spectacle was seen as stubborn, even foolish, by many. The whispers started, "Bezos doesn't understand the new economy." The criticism was a constant, low-grade hum in the background of our lives. And then, the pop. It wasn't a slow leak, it was a detonation. In March of 2000, the Nasdaq Composite Index began a catastrophic plunge. The paper fortunes of the dot-com era evaporated in weeks. Companies that had been media darlings vanished overnight. The party was over, and the hangover was brutal. Our own stock was eviscerated. It plummeted from a high of over $100 to a gut-wrenching low of $6. The numbers on the screen felt like a physical blow. The same papers that had praised us were now writing our obituary. Amazon.toast, one headline famously declared. We were a punchline, a cautionary tale. The "I told you so" chorus was deafening. The pressure was no longer a background hum, it was a vice, tightening around all of us. I had to stand in front of my team, the people who had left stable jobs to follow my dream, and project confidence while my own stomach was churning with acid and doubt. I had to face investors who had lost millions. I saw the fear in their eyes, the disappointment. I felt the weight of every single one of those lost dollars on my shoulders. It was my vision that had led them here. One particularly bleak evening, I sat alone in my office, long after everyone had gone home. The silence was oppressive. On my desk was a spreadsheet showing our catastrophic burn rate. We were bleeding cash. The walls felt like they were closing in. The logical, Wall Street-trained part of my brain whispered the sane conclusion: it was over. We had failed. The dream was dead. This was the emotional nadir. The dream of the garage had curdled into a nightmare of financial ruin. I stared out the window at the dark Seattle sky, the same city that had once represented such promise. The regret minimization framework felt like a cruel joke. What was the value of a lesson learned in a scorched earth failure? But as I sat there in the dark, my gaze fell on a simple, framed piece of paper one of our engineers had printed out and given me. It was a customer email. It wasn't a complaint. It was a thank you note. A woman from a small town in the Midwest thanked us for delivering a rare medical textbook for her son, a book she had spent years trying to find. She wrote, "You have no idea what this means to us." In that moment, the fog of doubt began to lift. The stock price was an abstraction, the headlines were noise. But that email, that was real. That was the why. We weren't just a stock ticker, we were a service. We were connecting people with products, with knowledge, with stories they couldn't find anywhere else. The core idea was still sound. The tidal wave of the internet hadn't disappeared, the froth had just been wiped from its crest. I stood up, my body aching with fatigue, but my mind suddenly, terrifyingly clear. We were not going to play defense. We were not going to simply cut costs and pray for survival. To retreat was to die a slow, inevitable death. We had to double down. We had to become more than a bookstore. We had to bet the entire company on the one thing nobody else saw coming. We had to turn our internal strength, our robust, battle-tested technical infrastructure, into our greatest weapon. The storm had stripped everything away, revealing the solid, unsexy foundation we had built. It was time to build a fortress on it. And that fortress would be called Amazon Web Services. The gamble would be all or nothing, and the first move was mine to make. The silence in the conference room was heavier than any I had ever known. It was the summer of 2000, and the air still smelled of burnt dreams from the dot-com crash. Around the polished table sat my most trusted leaders, the engineers, the financiers, the visionaries who had stayed when so many had fled. They looked tired. We all were. The ghost of our $100 stock price haunted the room. I stood before them, a single whiteboard behind me. On it, I had drawn two simple, concentric circles. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice cutting through the grim atmosphere. "The world thinks we're dying. They're writing our obituary. And they're right, if we continue like this." I tapped the inner circle. "This is what we are today. A bookstore. A very good one, but just a bookstore. Our survival depends on us becoming this." My marker slammed into the outer circle with a definitive thud. A senior financial analyst, a man whose job was to find pennies in the couch cushions, cleared his throat. "Jeff, with all due respect, we're fighting for our lives. We need to be cutting costs, not expanding into fantasy." He wasn't wrong. It was the sane, rational perspective. But sanity was a luxury we could no longer afford. "The fantasy," I countered, "is believing we can shrink our way to greatness. We have a weapon nobody else sees." I turned to the head of our infrastructure team, a brilliant, quiet woman named Sarah. "Tell them about the servers." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes alight with a passion that belied the grim financials. "To handle our holiday rush, we built a computing infrastructure that is massively over-provisioned for 90% of the year. It's the most scalable, reliable system on the planet. And it sits idle, costing us a fortune, while thousands of startups are struggling to build their own from scratch. They're wasting capital and time that they don't have." I picked up the thread. What if we sold them our excess capacity? What if we turned our cost center into a profit engine? What if we stopped selling just things and started selling computation? The room erupted. It was chaos. "We're a retailer. This is a distraction. We'll be laughed out of the room." The word insanity was used more than once. I let the storm rage. Then I raised a hand. "During the gold rush," I said, quietly, "the surest way to get rich wasn't to mine for gold. It was to sell shovels." I paused, letting the analogy hang in the air. "The internet is the new gold rush. Everyone is scrambling to build their digital mine. We will be the ones who sell them the shovels. We will call it Amazon Web Services." The gamble was set. We were going to bet the entire, fragile company on becoming a shovel salesman. The following 2 years were a blur of manic, clandestine work. While the business press continued to speculate on our impending demise, a small, dedicated team worked in a sealed-off section of our headquarters, which we jokingly called the bunker. The energy there was electric, a stark contrast to the grim determination in the rest of the company. We were building the future, brick by digital brick. I made a rule: we would not ask for permission. We would build the service so compelling, so fundamentally useful, that its adoption would be inevitable. We focused on the most basic, painful problems every developer faced: storage and processing power. We built the simple storage service, S3, and the elastic compute cloud, EC2. The names were intentionally bland, practical. We weren't selling magic, we were selling utility, like electricity from a wall outlet. The launch, on March 14, 2006, was not a splashy media event. It was a quiet post on our developer blog. There was no bell to ring. We held our breath. The response was not a trickle, it was a dam break. Within hours, developers were flooding onto the platform. A tiny photo-sharing startup called Flickr was an early adopter. A fledgling streaming service named Netflix began experimenting with it. They weren't just customers, they were partners in our experiment. They were building their dreams on our foundation. Every API call, every gigabyte stored, was a vote of confidence. It was the garage all over again, but on a global, monumental scale. The internal shift was palpable. The defensive, survivalist posture that had gripped Amazon began to melt away, replaced by a new, audacious confidence. We had created an entirely new industry, cloud computing, and we were its undisputed pioneer. The shovels were a runaway success. But success, I was learning, is not a destination you arrive at, it's a new landscape you must navigate. And this new landscape was about to present a challenge far more personal and devastating than any stock market crash. The very foundation of my personal life, the partnership that had made all of this possible, was beginning to fracture. Mackenzie had been with me in the garage. She had believed in the bookstore when it was just a scribble on a roadmap. But the company Amazon had become was a different beast, a global, demanding, all-consuming entity. The man I had become was different, too. I was no longer the driven entrepreneur building a bookstore. I was the CEO of a tech behemoth, a public figure, a target for criticism. The long hours, the constant travel, the unrelenting pressure, they had taken a silent toll. The shared dream that had once bound us together was now a force pulling us apart. We tried, for years, to bridge the growing chasm. We scheduled family dinners, vacations, forced moments of normalcy. But the shadow of Amazon was always there, in the phone buzzing with an urgent call, in the mind constantly preoccupied with the next crisis, the next opportunity. The company that was built on connection was, ironically, disconnecting the very partnership that had given it life. One evening, I came home late from the office. The house was quiet. Mackenzie was waiting for me in the living room, a single lamp casting long shadows. Her expression was one I hadn't seen since the darkest days of the bubble burst, a mixture of profound sadness and unwavering resolve. "We can't keep doing this, Jeff," she said, her voice steady but soft. "The company needs all of you. And I need a partner. This," she gestured between us, "isn't a partnership anymore. It's a relic." Her words didn't land like a blow. They settled like a final, quiet truth. There was no anger, no dramatic accusation. Just the simple, heartbreaking acknowledgement of a reality we had both been avoiding. The dream we had built together had outgrown the life we had built together. The greatest gamble of my life was about to cost me the one thing that had always been my anchor. And as I sat there in the dim light, I knew that no amount of success could build a bridge back across the divide we had let grow. The finalization of the divorce was a quiet, procedural earthquake. There were no raised voices in a courtroom, just the sterile rustle of legal documents and the soft, final click of a pen. The settlement was historic, transferring a quarter of my Amazon stake to Mackenzie. The headlines were predictably brutal, the world's costliest divorce, but the true cost was immeasurable and utterly private. The person who had been my first believer, my co-conspirator in a garage, was now a chapter closed. The silence in my own home was deafening. I had gained unfathomable wealth and lost my foundation in the same breath. In the wake of that personal cataclysm, I did the only thing I knew how to do. I buried myself in the work. Amazon was no longer just a company. It was my sanctuary and my penance. The success of AWS had given us a seemingly unassailable lead, but a new, more subtle danger emerged: complacency. The Day One philosophy I had evangelized for years was being tested. We were, by any metric, a Day Two company, big, successful, and therefore vulnerable to stagnation. I called an all-hands meeting. The energy in the room was different now. It was no longer the desperate hunger of the startup years, but the confident hum of a champion. I had to shatter that comfort. Day two is stasis, I began, my voice echoing in the vast auditorium. Followed by irrelevance. Followed by an excruciating, painful decline. Followed by death. And I can assure you, that is not our fate. I laid out the pillars to fight it: a relentless obsession with the customer, a skeptical view of proxies and processes, an eager adoption of external trends, and high-velocity decision-making. If you have to make a decision with 90% of the information in a rapidly changing environment, you are probably moving too slow, I told them. Disagree and commit. Be wrong, but be wrong fast. This mandate unleashed a new wave of breathtaking, almost terrifying, innovation. The Kindle wasn't just a product, it was a statement. We were no longer just selling physical books. We were selling the very concept of reading, distilled into a seamless digital experience. I stood on stage at its launch, holding the slender device, feeling its weight. It was more than a gadget, it was a vessel for 1,000,000 stories, a library in your palm. The press was skeptical. Why would anyone give up the feel of a real book? But we had heard that before. We were betting on the future of the idea, not the container. Then came Alexa and the Echo. The idea of a voice-controlled assistant living in your home seemed like science fiction, even to many on my team. The early prototypes were clunky, misunderstanding simple commands. The board questioned the massive R&D investment. We're an e-commerce and cloud company, Jeff, not a hardware maker. But I saw the next fundamental shift in computing, from the keyboard to the touchscreen to the human voice. We were building the Star Trek computer, not for a starship, but for your living room. When the first Echo responded to the name Alexa with a warm, helpful glow, we knew we had once again tapped into a fundamental human desire, the desire for effortless connection. Amazon was now a behemoth, a global force. We had reshaped retail, created the cloud, revolutionized reading, and given a voice to the smart home. The ultimate validation came when we crossed the $1 trillion market capitalization threshold. The media that had once declared us toast now crowned us as one of the world's most valuable companies. I should have felt a supreme sense of victory. I had taken a garage dream and built an empire that had defied every prediction of its demise. But the higher you climb, the more distant the earth becomes, and the thinner the air feels. The summit was a lonely place. The divorce, though amicable, had left a void that no business success could fill. The constant scrutiny, the political hearings, the caricature of me as a billionaire Bond villain, it all created a barrier between me and the world. I was the face of a machine, no longer just a man who sold books. It was in this state of isolated triumph that I found myself one evening in a private hangar, standing before the sleek, almost organic form of a new Shepard rocket. My team at Blue Origin was performing final checks. I ran my hand along the cool, composite skin of the capsule. This had always been the real dream, hadn't it? The one that started not in a garage, but in the mind of a young boy gazing at the Apollo moon landings. The dream that was too big, too audacious, to speak aloud while building a bookstore. The mission control countdown crackled in my headset. I wasn't on board this flight, but my spirit was. I watched the rocket ignite, a controlled inferno of ambition and physics. It rose, slowly at first, then with accelerating, breathtaking purpose, piercing the cloud layer and disappearing into the deep blue of the upper atmosphere. A voice broke the silence on the comms. New Shepard has achieved suborbital altitude. The capsule has separated. Crew capsule is in 0G. On the monitor, I saw the video feed from inside the capsule. The seats were empty for this test flight, but a large, curved window looked out into the blackness of space. And there, hanging in the infinite void, was Earth. A fragile, brilliant blue marble, swirled with white, suspended in the utter blackness. There were no borders. No cities were visible. Just a single, breathtaking, and heartbreakingly isolated planet. In that moment, every triumph, every failure, every headline, and every personal regret shrunk to an invisible point. The ascent of Amazon, the painful personal sacrifices, the roar of the crowd, the silence of my home, it was all contained on that one, beautiful, vulnerable sphere. The capsule began its descent, the plasma of re-entry glowing orange against the windows. The image of that lonely Earth was burned into my mind. We had built Amazon to serve its people. But now, a new, more urgent question formed, a question that would define the next chapter, a question I would have to answer not as a CEO, but as a human being. The future of that blue marble was no longer a theoretical concern. It was the only mission that mattered now. And I knew, with a chilling and absolute certainty, that the greatest disruption was yet to come.